All right, Kyle, and we are live.
Awesome. It looks like everyone's in the Zoom room already. So let's just jump right on into it. And first, I wanted to say happy Earth Week to everyone on the call. But I wanted to highlight our California State Parks Earth Week logo contest before we dive into today's program. So if you look up on the screen, you can see a couple of our winners of California State Parks Earth Week logo contest, with Zoe at the very top winning this contest. And you can see second place, there was a tie down below, and third place just right on next to it. So thank you to everyone who submitted anything into this logo contest. And a special thank you to Zoe. We love your logo. It's extremely pretty. So thank you for doing that for us. Um, so I just wanted to highlight that before diving into anything today. And we could jump right on into it. And awesome. So thank you, Zoe. And I wanted to also say happy Earth Week to everyone. Earth Day is tomorrow, so this is a great way to get an early start on celebrating this Earth and some of the very great and spectacular things that are here. So, for today's program, I wanted to get started with some introductions. First, an introduction of myself, and then secondly, an introduction of this location where I'm at. This is one of my favorite state parks in all of California, and it happens to be where I spend most of my time working. So I'm going to give everyone those introductions. My name is Kyle, and I'm a California State Park interpreter. You can see my patch right there on the side of my shirt, and wearing our fancy hats as we usually do. And for those who are unfamiliar with what a California State Park interpreter does, which is normal because I didn't even know until I started working for California State Parks. But an interpreter, typically when we hear that word, a job title of an interpreter, I often think about a language translator. I think about someone that knows multiple languages and translates information back and forth. But a state park interpreter does something similar, but not with language. A state park interpreter actually looks at our state parks here in California and translates the cultural and natural importance of those state parks. So we like to dive into different topics that are related to state parks and educate the public or school groups or Californians alike that want to learn about these topics. So that's really what my job title is. But there's lots of different jobs within California state parks. Even though you see someone wearing this uniform, they could be doing a variety of different things. And if you're curious about working for state parks and making places like this your office, then you should dive into some of those job opportunities, or maybe volunteer at a local state park, because there's a lot of different stuff that you can do. And you could really find whatever interests you in this earth. And maybe it's wildflowers or it's animals or whatever it might be. And you could really take that interest and go far with state parks. So just wanted to mention that and wanted to introduce who I am and what I do with the parks, with California State Parks. But now I wanted to introduce this location, and this is Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. It's kind of a long title, Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, but right in the middle of our name, you hear the word redwoods. And we're one of the 40 or so California state parks that highlights redwood trees. And I wanted to show everyone where on a map redwood trees would grow within California, and then also where on a map that I'm actually standing at. So this will give everyone a better understanding of the state park, and maybe you want to visit one day, and this can help you find us. So, um, right up top, I have an image of all of California and some of the surrounding states, and there are some large cities that are highlighted on this map. As we can see, San Francisco, around the middle part of our state. And then if we go further south, we can see Los Angeles and San Diego. And I actually grew up in Los Angeles County, so I'm from Southern California, way down south. And right now, I'm working at a state park that is all the way up north where that red star is at. So if you look all the way to the very northwest tip of California, that's where I'm standing right now. And to give everyone some reference exactly on where I'm at, if I were to hop in my car and start driving north from where I'm at, it would only take me about 15 minutes to get to Oregon. So I'm only about 15 minutes from the California Oregon border. And if I were to drive towards the beach from where I'm at, it only takes about 10 minutes. So you can imagine I'm really at that last little corner of California, very far north and very far west. And this is what it looks like when you're at the state park. And I'm going to do a quick 360 with the camera so everyone can see what it looks like where I'm at today. And I'm actually going to stay quiet. So then you could kind of hear what the state park sounds like, or maybe hear what it doesn't sound like. So as I'm doing this 360, make some observations. Maybe you're noticing pretty cool things about our park, um, and and also pay attention to the sounds. So I hope you enjoyed what this state park looks like. I mean, it's one of my favorite parks. Um, And I forgot to mention at the very beginning, but we do have a Q&A box, a questions and answer box for this Portscast. And if you want to use it as a chat as well, that's all good with me. If any of the classrooms that are on this Portscast want to type in any of the observations that they made for as I was doing that 360, maybe something cool that you saw, maybe something interesting that jumped out to you, feel free to pop it up into that questions or Q&A box, and I might touch on some of the things that you noticed. Now, as I was doing that 360, I'm always mesmerized by one of the same things. So I turn around and get this view. I actually need to tilt my camera up a little bit to include all of these trees. If we look behind me, these are coast redwood trees. And I mentioned that redwoods is right in the middle of the name of our park. And these are the trees that we love to highlight within Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. And they're actually a really special tree for our state. They're almost like our mascot. They've been declared our state tree, our coastal redwoods. And what is really fascinating about coast redwood trees is that they are the tallest trees in the entire world. So no matter where you travel from, whether you're going to South America, Asia, Africa, Europe, all these different continents around this world, coast redwood trees would be the tallest tree that you would find today. And they can grow to extreme heights. I want everyone to imagine a football field, maybe like the Super Bowl field that happens every year where they play a very big football game and a lot of people are watching it. And imagine the field that they're playing on. And if you were to go from end zone to end zone or field goal to field goal, and you were to stand that Super Bowl field all the way up to where it's standing, these coast redwood trees would be even taller than it. These trees can grow up to heights up to 380 feet tall. That's extremely tall. You can maybe imagine how many of yourselves you would need to stack up to be as tall as a redwood tree. And it would be a lot of yourselves. I mean, you could even see my car, which is right over there. It looks tiny compared to these tall redwood trees. So I just wanted to mention that the tallest trees in the world right behind us. And we're just really lucky to live in California alongside these trees. And I'll tilt my camera back down. But a really awesome tree to live alongside. So that's what the state park is all about, is redwood trees. But there's a lot more when you dive into Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. And in fact, we're part of this weird partnership with a couple other state parks and national parks known as Redwood National and State Parks. It's this weird partnership where we all work together to help and protect and educate about these trees. And if you were to visit the national park website, one of the very first things that you would notice as you go into that national park website is this quote right on the front page. And this is just a screen grab that I took right off the front page of Redwood National and State Park's website. And it says, so much more than the tallest trees. I did just highlight some of the tallest trees in the world, but I want you to know that Redwood National and State Parks has so much more. Beyond tall trees, we have this beautiful river running right through the center of our park. We have beautiful coastal habitats, a really beautiful section of coastline with really rocky and jagged, wild looking coast, all within the park. So there's a lot of different things that you can do if you ever come and visit this state and national park partnership. So today we're actually going to be talking a little bit about the trees, but we're going to be talking about one of the animals that lives here that spends most of its time out on that rocky coastline that I was talking about. And that's because today's program is called Seabird Storytime. So for Seabird Storytime, we're going to be talking about a seabird. So the very first thing that we're going to do is just learn a little bit about seabirds and what it really means to be a seabird. And then we're going to highlight the story of this very special seabird that lives here at Redwood National State Parks. And then we're going to talk about certain things that the park has done to really help and protect these seabirds, and certain things that you can do as an individual and as a citizen of this earth to help out the marbled murrelet. So we'll talk all about this seabird in just a second. But first, let's jump back to the beginning of what exactly is a seabird. And I wanted to pull up a definition while we're talking about this. And I'm going to pull up the definition of what a seabird is. So, just the standard definition, if you were to type it into any search bar of what is the definition of a seabird, most likely you would come across something like this: birds that are adapted to life within marine environments. So seabirds are not only birds that you can see while you're out at the ocean, and sometimes there might be a bird that's migrating through or might have been lost or whatever it might be, and it's hanging out by the ocean. But seabirds, specifically, this category of birds, are birds that are adapted to life within marine environments. So these are birds that spend the most of their time out in the ocean, and they're adapted to that life. And I wanted to turn to some of the classrooms, and we're going to use the Q&A box as a chat box because I'm going to ask you a question, and then you can type in your answers to the Q&A box. So my question is, we know that seabirds are adapted to life in marine environments, but what might some of those adaptations be? What might be something that a seabird has that really helps it to live out there on the water? And maybe you could think about other birds that are very adapted to living out in water. And what characteristics do they have? And I'll give all classrooms just about a minute to 2 minutes to gather up together and see if you come up with any answers that you could type into the chat box or into the Q&A box of what adaptations do you think some seabirds have, or birds that are adapted to living on water? So I'll step out of frame and I'll be back in just about 90 seconds or so to check on the chat box. So I'm seeing a couple answers of what adaptations seabirds might have versus other birds. And when I'm thinking about this question, I'm thinking about adaptations for birds that live on water. A lot of the time, I think about birds that might need to swim more than other birds. And an adaptation that they could have could be webbed feet. So instead of having toes that are all separated, kind of like my fingers are on my hands, they'll have webbed feet, which is a thin layer of skin going in between each toe or each finger. And that really helps them swim in the water. So that's one adaptation that you might see with seabirds. One of the things that makes them different from other birds. And the only or some of the other birds that I think that have that same adaptation of having webbed feet could be a bird like a duck. And often, whenever I see ducks, it's often on lakes or lagoons or different bodies of water, and they'll be swimming along on the top of the river or on top of the lake and using their webbed feet to get around. So that's a really perfect adaptation for living on water, whether it's freshwater or in those marine environments like seabirds. Now, when I'm also thinking about ducks that spend lots of time on water, those ducks often are a bit more plump than other birds. They've got a different body shape than maybe a hummingbird or a bald eagle or a falcon. Those ducks are typically a little heavier and more adapted to being on that cold surface of water. And it also affects how those ducks fly. And ducks and seabirds fly in a very similar manner because they're both adapted to living on water. And a lot of their adaptations are for being on top of water and not flying per se. So when I think about a duck flying, I think about that duck moving at one speed and one speed only. I think about that duck moving as fast as it can through the air and flapping its wings nonstop. When I think about other birds flying, like those bald eagles and falcons, sometimes you can watch them in the sky and they'll just have their wings out and they'll be gliding for minutes at a time, and you won't even watch them flap their wings. Now, that's very different to the way that a duck would fly or a seabird. And sometimes I'll see hummingbirds flying throughout the forest, and they'll be going from flower to flower, moving extremely fast and with a lot of precision because they need to stay at the same flower long enough to stick their bill inside and get some of the nectar. So hummingbirds move really fast and with a lot of precision, kind of like my hands moving right now, but very different than a duck or other seabirds. And that's because those ducks and seabirds are very adapted to living on water. Yes, they can fly, but maybe not with the same charisma as a hawk or as a hummingbird. So that's going to play a key part throughout our story today, are some of these adaptations that ducks and seabirds have. Now, I want to bring it back to our very specific seabird that the story is going to be about, and it's the marbled murrelet. And let me show everyone a picture of what the marbled murrelet looks like, just so we're all familiar with this bird. So here's an image of the marbled murrelet living its life out sea, just like all the other seabirds. And it's floating around. It almost looks kind of like a duck, not quite. It doesn't have the same style of bill. And in real life, they are really small birds. They're probably about the size of a big potato. Um, and they're floating along the water. And marbled murrelets are fantastic at living on the ocean. And they could swim very well. And in fact, they've adapted to use their wings not only for flight, because they can fly, but also to help them swim. So when this marbled murrelet does see a fish swimming below it that it wants to hunt for, that marbled murrelet will duck under into the ocean and use its wings almost like flippers. It'll use its wings to help it swim and move water around to then go hunting for that fish. So a really prolific hunter out there in the ocean, and a very classic seabird. So this is what the marbled murrelet looks like, and we're going to be talking about its story. And because the marbled murrelet lives out on sea, a lot of its story is going to be out there on the ocean. So to start out with the marbled murrelet story, I want everyone to rewind the clock. We're in the year 2025 right now, but if we rewind that clock all the way to the early 1970s, or maybe even the 1960s. So let's rewind it, go all the way back 60 years or so. And a lot of people loved looking for the marbled murrelet. And not only researchers and people that work for the parks, but just Californians alike. A lot of the public love looking for the marbled murrelet and all sorts of other birds. And they would engage in an activity known as bird watching, where they head out to beautiful locations just like this with binoculars, and they just be looking for birds and jotting down what they see and creating a list of all the different and cool, unique birds that they find. So the marbled murrelet was one of those birds that people love to look for. But to look for this bird, they would have to go on these adventures way out in the ocean. And let me just pull up a picture. And these people would hop out on boats and they'd head out maybe a mile or two out into the ocean. They'd find these big pods of seabirds, and occasionally there'd be some strangler seabirds at other locations. They'd pull out their binoculars and they'd start jotting down every single bird that they saw. And year after year, as people were doing this, they noticed that they were seeing less and less marbled murrelets. And they wondered, they thought, well, just about a couple years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, we were seeing a lot more of these birds. Why are they declining in population? Why can't we find them in the same numbers as we used to? And they go looking and looking, and they just notice this trend of less and less marbled murrelets. And because these people, these Californians and other people, really enjoyed looking for birds, they notified researchers. They said, hey, we're noticing that there's a lot less marbled murrelets than there was decades ago. So maybe we could do some research and try to understand why there's less marbled murrelets than other seabirds. So groups of researchers, people like myself and other park employees and independent researchers would head out to the ocean and they'd start monitoring marbled murrelets, and they started noticing the same trend, that they were declining in population. So they scratched their head, and like any good researcher, they wanted to find out the source of the issue. Why were the marbled murrelets declining in population? So they were studying and they were driving around on their boats, and they thought, maybe it has to do with what the marbled murrelet eats. Maybe there's not enough of the tiny little fish that the marbled murrelet love to eat in this area of the coastline. So they were driving around looking for fish, and they were seeing fish, and they were seeing other birds not declining that ate the same food as the marbled murrelet. So they thought, well, if we're spotting fish, and if these other seabirds aren't declining as well, then it's probably not the fish that's causing this massive decline in population for the marbled murrelet. They scratched their head and they figured, oh, well, it's probably not that. Let's think about what else could make the marbled murrelet decline in population. And they thought, maybe it has to do with how the marbled murrelet nests and how it produces babies. So they started researching the marbled murrelet's nest. And they thought, well, this is a seabird, so it probably nests out on one of the sea stacks here in California. And I'm going to pull up a picture of what a sea stack is. So they went to go research and started looking along the very rocky coast of California. And sea stacks are those rocks that pop out off the coast of Northern California. And often it's a really great place for these seabirds to lay their eggs and nest. So researchers started studying these rock outcroppings in the middle of the ocean. They were looking for the marbled murret's nest. They thought this would be a great place for this bird because it's really adapted to living out in the ocean. And if it were to have its nest on land or on the mainland of California, then it would probably have to deal with a lot of different predators. There's a lot of different animals that would love to eat a marbled murret's egg. Maybe different coyotes and different foxes and bobcats, and even other birds would probably like to eat the marbled murret's nest. So a nice, safe place for that marbled murret to lay its eggs would be way out there on the ocean where it does not have to worry about bobcats or about coyotes and foxes and all these different animals. But as they were researching, they could not find a single marbled murret nest. And they kept checking, and they checked all the sea stacks. And then next, they went to some of the cliff sides along the ocean and started checking there, and they couldn't find a marbled murret's nest. So researchers felt like they were on the right path. They thought, we can't find its nest, so it probably has something to do with that. But first, we still need to find it. And these researchers kept searching and searching and searching, and they never ended up finding it. And while all this is happening, and there's a great mystery going on about the marbled murret's nest, there's something happening on land here in California. And on land, throughout the Redwood Coast, there was a lot of different logging operations. People saw these trees and they thought, what beautiful trees. And their wood grain is so red and pretty. It'd be such a nice tree to start building with. So lots of people were logging these trees and building homes and building schools and hospitals and all these great things that we need as humans. But they were cutting down these trees and spending a lot of time in the forest. And as these loggers were spending day and night out there in the forest logging these trees so cities could get built, they became really in tune with what lives out here in the forest. They spent most of their days out here in the forest. So they knew a lot of the different salamanders that lived out here. They knew a lot of the different plants that grew out here, a lot of the different owls and other birds that live in the forest. And these loggers knew a lot about the forest. And every morning they'd wake up really early to go to their jobs out here in the forest. And they'd be having their coffee even before the sun gets up. They'd be up really early having their coffee and getting ready to get to work. And as they were getting ready, almost every morning from around this time of the year, around late April, May, all the way through summer, every morning they would hear this bird flying at the very top of the trees. And this bird would be calling out, and it sounded like a seabird. It sounded like a bird that would spend most of its time out at the ocean. And there's a certain sound that a lot of the seabirds have. And I want you to think about seagulls and other birds that spend time out there in the ocean and the noise that they make. And it kind of has like a high pitched noise, almost like a chirp, chirp, similar noise to that. And they were noticing that in the forest. And they scratched their heads. They thought, that's kind of weird. We're 10 miles or even more from the ocean. And the seabirds flying at the very top of the trees. And sometimes they'd even be able to see the seabird, but it'd be moving too fast. And it'd be moving at that one speed, going as fast as it can through the forest. And they'd be like, oh, there's one of those birds. We don't know exactly what it is, but let's just call it a fog lark or a fog robin. And they kind of made up different names for this bird that they couldn't identify, but they knew and they heard and they'd see it almost every morning. And they thought, oh, well, we've got to get to work, so let's put that aside. And they'd get to work. And this bird kept flying over every morning. And it was kind of a mystery as well to those loggers at the time. And at the same time, there's lots of different things going on. But at the same time, there were also researchers here in the Redwood Forest that noticed the same thing as those loggers. They'd wake up really early to research the redwoods, and they'd go throughout the forest, and every morning they would realize that there'd be a seabird flying at the very top of the trees. And those researchers weren't just studying the redwood forest, but they were really studying the redwood canopy, the very top of these trees. Now, I wanted to show you what these researchers looked like as they were researching these trees. And these researchers would climb to the very top of these trees to learn about more information about what lives at the top of redwood trees. And they were finding all sorts of discoveries. They were finding even new trees living at the top of redwood trees. They'd find baby little seedlings of other trees that typically grow on the ground, but they'd be hundreds of feet up in the air growing off of a redwood tree. They were noticing different salamanders and just a bunch of different animals that live at the very tops of these trees. And one day, as these researchers were climbing up these trees, one of the researchers looked over and noticed a marbled murrelet. And that researcher found the first marbled murrelet nest in the redwood forest. And it solved the mystery of where the marbled murrelet nest, and it also solved the mystery of why the marbled murrelets were declining in population. And they saw this marbled murrelet laying on top of its egg and kind of hiding way up top at the top of these forests, and they solved it. First, they found out, yep, it lives at the very top of these trees whenever it's nesting. And then second, they realized why it was declining in population. And they realized it was largely tied to the fact that we were logging a lot of the redwood forest here in California. So that meant that the marbled murrelet didn't have the same amount of trees to lay their eggs on. So this just meant that there was a lot less space for the marbled murrelet. And to give everyone an idea of how many redwoods got cut during that time period, we only have about 5% of the original redwood forest here in California. So we only have 5% of the old growth redwoods still standing here in California. That's like if everyone in the classroom was working for $100. Let's say I made you guys all come over to our state park and do a lot of trail work. And I said, hey, I'll give you $100 to do all of this trail work. You're going to really, smooth out this trail. You're going to cut down any plants that are encroaching on this trail. And you're going to do a lot of hard work. But don't worry, I'm going to give you $100 at the end of the day. But then at the very end of the day, I came over and I was like, hey guys, something happened. And instead, I'm going to give you $5. And that's all you get to keep. You got $5, and I'm going to keep the $95 that I said I was going to pay you. So here's $5, and I'll see you guys later. And that's kind of what happened to the marbled murrelet. It had all of this forest, 100% of the old growth here in California to lay its eggs on. And then after a lot of the human logging that took place here, they only had 5% of that same space. And that's why they were declining in population. Now, luckily, there's a lot of people that were concerned about the marbled murrelet. And they started researching ways that we can help this bird bounce back from being in such a low population state. So researchers got together and they figured, well, one thing that this marbled murrelet needs is more redwood forest. While we talk about the redwood forest, I'm going to turn over to it. So they thought, well, there needs to be more old growth, more large trees for these birds to nest in. And something that we can do as a state park, because there's lots of people that work for the state park, so we're a lot of people working together, is we can work together as a team to try and restore some of those areas that we logged in the past. So state parks, along with some other partners like the National Park Service and Save the Redwoods League, which is a nonprofit, but these groups of people, these large groups of people, are getting together and trying to figure out how we can improve the areas of the forest that were logged maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago. And we're going into those areas and we're trying to make them healthier. We're trying to position those areas of the forest in a manner in which they can grow to become the old growth of the future. And this is all happening under a really large restoration project called Redwood's Rising. So, this is a perfect example of humans gathering up together and working together to try and help out the forest and try and help out these marbled murrelet birds as citizens of the earth and trying to provide more habitat for them to lay their eggs in. But that's a really large action. It takes a lot of people. So that's one of the things that the park's doing. And another really large action that's happening here in California has to do with protecting the marbled murrelets and other animals out there when they're on the ocean. So I've been mentioning that the marbled murrelet lays its eggs and nests way up in the forest here, but it spends the majority of its life out there on the ocean. So something that California has done to really help out the marbled murrelets is California has designed a series of marine protected areas. Now, I'm going to pull up a definition of what marine protected area is because it's kind of a weird title and it's a lot different than state parks or national parks or all these other public agencies. But a marine protected area is this, and we have the definition up front, and I kind of broke it down word by word, but it's a marine place, so it's of or found in or produced by the sea. So we could think about places way out there on the ocean. We could think about places that are near shore, but places out there but on the sea. And then protected, in this case, really means that it's preserved from harm, especially by formal or legal measures. So to me, that means protected in this instance means that there's different laws and rules that people need to follow in those places to help and protect them and preserve them from harm. And then lastly, an area just really means a region. So a really mapped out place where these protections are put in place. So California has designed a series of these all along the coast. And let me actually show you guys a picture of a map of all the marine protected areas here in California. And these are all areas along the coastline where there are formal and legal measures to really help and protect all of the animals living out there in the ocean. So here's one of the maps that you can use for finding out some of those marine protected areas in California. And you can see they're all along the coastline of California. They're all those colorful dots along the coast, which makes sense because it's a marine area, so should be out there on the coastline. But you can notice that there's a lot of different colors. There's, certain red dots, there's blue dots, I see some green dots. There's all these different colors of dots along the coastline. And that's because each one of these marine protected areas has different rules or regulations to really fit the animals that live in those locations. So there's a marine protected area up by me, and some of those rules have to do with fishing regulations. So the one right outside of Crescent City is known as Castle Rock Marine Protected Area. And the Castle Rock area has lots of different seabirds. It has lots of sea lions and seals that hang out there. And some of the rules and regulations is that you can't fish there. So there's no fishing. So any of the fish population there is really used by those different animals that live there. And then also, you can't take a motorized boat out there. So it's really reducing the amount of noise within the water by reducing the amount of motorized boats that are near Castle Rock. So each one of these locations have different rules that could be similar or different than those that I just mentioned. And that's something that California is doing to help and protect all of the animals out there in our marine environments, including the marbled murrelet. So That's something that we can do as a large scale, as a lot of people working together to help out the marbled murrelet. But I wanted to talk about certain things that you can do as an individual to help out the marbled murrelet. And one of the large things that you can do that's almost kind of like an underlying theme of today's story is that you can really help out all of the researchers here in California. So earlier I was mentioning the researchers that were out on the coast looking for marbled murrelets and their nest. And I was talking about some of the loggers and some of the researchers out here in the forest that were researching different topics. And those two research teams, one in the forest and one way out there on the ocean, there wasn't really a way for them to communicate that well. There wasn't, there wasn't the internet at the way that it is now for them to really talk to each other and email each other back and forth some of their findings. And there just wasn't the resources for those two teams to communicate. But luckily, right now, there are great resources for us Californians and researchers to communicate freely. And one of the ways that we could do that is this app known as iNaturalist. So it's an app that you could download to your phone or computer known as iNaturalist. And it's a way for members of the community like myself to engage in citizen science. So iNaturalist, the way that you use it is that whenever you're out on a hike, or maybe you're in your backyard and you see a cool bird, or you see a cool bug, or maybe a cool flower, you just take a picture of whatever you're seeing, you upload it to the app as an observation, and the app does two things. First, it helps you identify what that flower or what that bird might be. So if you didn't know what that flower was, it's like, oh, awesome. I'll take a picture, upload it to the computer, upload it to iNaturalist, and I'll learn about this flower. And then I could research it and learn a lot more about the world around me and the earth around you. Now, the second thing that iNaturalist does is that it takes all of your photos and it creates this massive database for researchers to use. So, along our Seabird story, if some of those loggers or some of those researchers out in the forest took their phone out in the morning and they recorded the noise of the bird that was flying at the very top of the trees, and if they recorded that bird as it flew over and it went chirp, chirp, and they got that seabird sound, and if they uploaded it to iNaturalist, those researchers out on the coast would have been able to access that data, and it would have helped them find where the marbled murrelet was nesting. So this is something that you can do right now, is that you could take pictures of different things out here in the forest or different birds, or record those birds as they're flying over, upload it to the app, and researchers that are studying those animals or those plants will be able to have more data and more information to research them further. So this is a great way that you can really participate as a researcher. So those are just a couple of things that are going on to help out the marbled murrelet and other animals here, and certain things that you can do, like downloading the app iNaturalist and really paying attention to these birds out on the coast and when they're here in the forest. So I hope everyone enjoyed today's Portscast, because we talked about a lot of stuff. We started out with Earth Day, and we've talked about seabirds, talked about the story of the marbled murrelet, and some other things that the park is doing and that you can do to really help out the marbled murrelets and other researchers here in California. So hopefully you enjoyed it. And I wanted to mention that there are a lot of different Earth Day Portscasts happening throughout this week. So take a look at the Ports website if you want to sign up for another one. But besides that, I hope everyone has a great Earth Day tomorrow and a great rest of their week celebrating this Earth. And we'll see you soon at another Portscast. So everyone have a great rest of your day.